The midnight clock and the Northwest Gate. The stability of the Western world ended not with a bang, but with a jurisdictional snarl at the Northwest Gate. At 6:23 p.m., the American experiment entered a state of sovereign friction, so acute it threatened to liquefy the chain of command. On one side of the iron bars, 4 U.S. Marshals stood as the physical manifestation of a Senate conviction, the judgment in cases of impeachment, finally transitioning from ink to iron. On the other, Secret Service agents, conditioned by years of proximity to power, defaulted to a state of executive contumacy. This was the Praetorian risk realized. For 12 hours, the gate was a fault line between two conflicting definitions of reality. The intellectual hook is chilling. Can two agencies, both fueled by taxpayer dollars and sworn to the same parchment, legally engage in a firefight? In the shadows of the North Portico, the answer was a vibrating yes. The standoff was a brutal stress test for institutional resilience. If the agents fired, the Constitution was a cadaver. If they stood down, the presidency was a temp job. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of a command vacuum. Inside the West Wing, the former president operated under the delusion of strongman exceptionalism, convinced that the walls of the White House were a fortress of sovereign immunity. He was wrong. The gate wasn't just a physical barrier. It was the last stand of a dying interpretation of the unitary executive. The director's gamble? At 8:47 p.m., Director Kimberly Cheadle broke the fever. Her arrival was the surgical strike that prevented a civil war on the South Lawn. She didn't appeal to the agents' hearts. She appealed to their bureaucratic neutrality and their fear of the law. By invoking 18 U.S. Code Paragraph 3056, she effectively executed a status quo ante-pivot before the first shot could be fired. Cheadle's ultimatum was a masterpiece of cold, clinical power. The service protects the office, not the occupant. To obstruct the Marshals was no longer a defensive act. It was a felony. This was the moment of mandate nullification. One by one, the protective circle evaporated, proving that even the most loyal guard will not die for a man who no longer holds the seal. The transition was a masterclass in hard sovereignty. At what exact second does a president's detail become a kidnapping squad? The answer is the moment the Senate clerk records the 67th guilty. When Cheadle entered the Oval Office, she wasn't an advisor. She was the herald of a systemic correction. The king was gone. Only the man remained, the resolute desk confrontation. The 3:47 a.m. entry into the Oval Office was a masterclass in de facto deposal. When the 4 deputy U.S. Marshals crossed the threshold, they weren't merely walking into a room. They were punctured a hole in the myth of executive invincibility. The former president sat at the resolute desk, a 1,300-pound oak bulwark, clinging to the physical symbols of power as his legal authority evaporated in real time. The intellectual hook here is haunting. Why did the enforcement arm wait for the dead of night? Because in the darkness, the theater of the presidency dies. Without the press corps, the motorcade, or the cheering crowds, a president is just a man in an expensive chair. The lead marshal's voice was devoid of malice, carrying only the weight of jurisdictional supremacy. He didn't ask, he notified. The "sir" was a courtesy to the history of the office, not the person currently occupying it. Inside those 16 minutes, the air in the room grew heavy with the realization that the enforcement mechanism of the state is indifferent to ego. The former president's response, labeling the act illegal, was a desperate attempt to invoke a shadow constitution that simply no longer existed. He was looking for sovereign friction to save him, but he found only the cold, hard wall of the law. When he finally stood, the desk remained, but the power had already bled out of the room. He didn't just lose his office, he lost the legal armor that made him untouchable. The state had stripped him bare. The 68-vote guillotine, the mechanism that enabled the 3:47 a.m. removal, was the bipartisan supermajority validation achieved only hours prior. To understand the gravity of the 68-32 vote is to understand the nuclear threshold of American politics. This wasn't a partisan skirmish. It was a total systemic correction. For over 2 centuries, the impeachment power was a ghost, a theoretical deterrent that no one believed would ever be sharpened into a blade. On February 11, 2026, it became a physical force of nature. The inclusion of 17 Republicans, men and women who effectively signed their own political death warrants, signaled a rare alignment of institutional resilience. They didn't vote against a man. They voted to preserve the constitutional solvency of the legislative branch. Is a Senate conviction a political opinion or a self-executing judicial death sentence? The answer is now settled. It is a terminal event. This 68-vote guillotine severed the executive's connection to the will of the people, replacing it with the rule of law. The 12-hour gap between conviction and removal was not a delay of doubt, but the necessary time for the gears of the administrative state to grind the former president's remaining leverage into dust. By the time the sun rose, the precedential weight of this moment had already begun to reshape the global understanding of democratic accountability. The silent transfer, 4:15 a.m., At 4:15 a.m., the Oval Office witnessed the most dangerous moment in any democracy, the empty chair scenario. For 12 minutes, the most powerful office on earth was technically vacant. Then the new president entered. There was no fanfare, no Inauguration Day parade, no televised oaths. There was only a signature on an executive order. This was the status quo ante-mechanism in its purest form, a total restoration of the lawful chain of command. The intellectual hook is profound. How does a new leader gain instant legitimacy from a sprawling 3 million-person bureaucracy that was loyal to a different man 5 minutes earlier? The answer lies in the machine's inherent bureaucratic neutrality. The federal government is a ship that recognizes only the captain's hat, not the face beneath it. The first order was a resync pulse sent to every military command and cabinet department. It was a signal of mandate nullification for the predecessor and total acquisition for the successor. As the order hit the wires, the shadow of the former president's defiance was deleted from the system. Capital markets, which had been pricing in a political risk premium for weeks, began to settle. The machinery of state had already forgotten the former president's name before his SUV cleared the White House gates. This silent transfer proved that while individuals can be defiant, the system is designed to be indifferent. The macro-political stability of the United States was preserved not by a person, but by a process that refused to blink. The crisis was over because the paperwork said so. The political question barrier. When Chief Justice Roberts released his brief, icy statement at 9 a.m., he wasn't just observing history. He was bearing the former president's last hope for a judicial resurrection. The intellectual hook here is a matter of terminal sovereignty. Can a removed leader sue his way back into a chair that has already been filled? The answer from the Marble Palace was a resounding no. By leaning into the political question doctrine, the court signaled a state of judicial non-interventionism that effectively quarantined the impeachment process within the halls of Congress. The court's refusal to act as an appellate body for the Senate conviction established an impenetrable wall of jurisdictional supremacy. The former president's legal team had banked on a stay, a delay, or a granular review of the fraudulent impeachment evidence. Instead, they hit the bedrock of the Constitution's text. Roberts' message was clear. The Senate has the sole power to try impeachments, and sole means exactly that. This was the final closure of the legal loop. The Supreme Court didn't just stay out of the fight. They slammed the door and locked it from the inside, leaving the deposed executive to scream into a void where his motions carried no precedential weight. The sovereign risk premium. By 10 a.m., the cold logic of global finance began to override the heat of political grievance. The intellectual hook is counterintuitive. Why did the markets stabilize the moment the most powerful man in the world was forcibly evicted? Because capital does not crave justice. It craves the preservation of constitutional solvency. The political risk premium that had been strangling U.S. Treasury bonds for weeks, driven by the specter of a dual presidency, evaporated at 4:03 a.m. The macro-political stability of the United States is the ultimate collateral for the global financial system. When the U.S. Marshals facilitated the departure, they weren't just moving a man, they were de-risking the dollar. Investors watched the 68-32 vote and saw a system capable of self-correction, not a state in collapse. The enforcement mechanism proved that the American operating system could survive a corrupted kernel. While the streets argued about the fairness of the removal, the algorithms were already buying the dip. The Marshals provided the one thing the Fed never could, the physical proof that the rules still applied to the person at the top. Certainty is the only currency that matters in a crisis, and the 3:47 a.m. entry was a massive injection of liquidity into the soul of the Republic. The global strongman postmortem. Across the Atlantic and the Pacific, the 2026 removal of an American president sent a shockwave through the palaces of strongman regimes. The intellectual hook is a geopolitical mirror. Did the U.S. just provide a how-to guide for a coup or a how-to guide for a democracy's survival? For leaders in Budapest, Brasilia, and beyond, the imagery was a warning of institutional resilience. The era of strongman exceptionalism, the idea that a populist mandate could act as a permanent shield against the legislature, hit a brick wall in the West Wing. The geopolitical systemic correction is profound. Adversaries who relied on American polarization to paralyze the state were suddenly confronted with a government that could, in extreme circumstances, find a bipartisan consensus of 68. The 17 Republicans who crossed the line became a new variable in the calculus of global power. They proved that the rule of law is not just a rhetorical flourish, but a functional enforcement mechanism. Abroad, the narrative shifted from America in decay to America in discipline. This wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a demonstration of hard sovereignty. By purging its own executive through a transparent, albeit brutal, constitutional process, the U.S. reestablished a benchmark for democratic accountability that had been missing for decades. The world realized that if the American system could do this to its own leader, it was still capable of doing anything to its enemies. Scenario 2, the permanent insurgency. The physical removal at 4:03 a.m. resolved the office, but it poisoned the well. While the machinery of state synchronized with the new executive, a massive demographic bloc transitioned into a state of psychological secession. The intellectual hook is a haunting prognosis. What happens when 50% of a nuclear-armed populace views the rule of law as a mere enforcement mechanism for a rule of force? We are no longer discussing a policy dispute. We are witnessing a legitimacy crisis that has become structural. The former president, now a civilian with a martyr's grievance, has become the symbol of a permanent insurgency. By refusing to leave voluntarily, he ensured that his departure would be framed not as a legal exit, but as a de facto deposal. This narrative weaponizes the sovereign friction of the standoff, turning the U.S. Marshals into occupiers in the eyes of his base. The invisible angle here is the radicalization of the loyalty reshuffle. Every federal employee, from the FBI supervisor to the local postmaster, is now viewed through the lens of a partisan litmus test. The crisis in the White House ended in the pre-dawn hours, but the crisis in the American mind has entered its most volatile phase. The system maintained its constitutional solvency, but it spent its last reserves of social trust to do so. The ghost in the Oval Office. The American presidency has been fundamentally recoded. Every future occupant of the resolute desk now sits in the shadow of the 3:47 a.m. precedent. The presidential weight of February 11th, 2026 has stripped the office of its mystical, above-the-law aura. The intellectual hook is existential. Is the presidency permanently weakened, or is it finally restrained? For 234 years, the executive was a ballooning entity. Today, it is a box with hard, lethal edges. Future leaders will govern with the knowledge that the constitutional nuclear option is no longer a ghost. It is a loaded gun on the table. The 17 Republicans who validated the removal have redefined the consensus threshold, proving that party loyalty has a breaking point when confronted with executive contumacy. This is the ultimate systemic correction. The president is no longer a monarch in a suit. He is a tenant at will, subject to the jurisdictional supremacy of a Senate that has finally found its teeth. The geopolitics of the future will be dictated by this internal discipline. Adversaries may see a fractured nation, but they also see a system that can physically purge its own head without a military coup. The Republic moved forward, not because it was united, but because its institutions were heavy enough to crush the resistance of a single man. Every future president will now look at that desk and see not just a seat of power, but a potential crime scene. The ghost of the removal is now the permanent co-occupant of the White House.